Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's event on decoupling desire, food consumption, advertising, and the question of limits. It's great to be here. Just by way of introductions, my name is Tara Garnett. I'm director of Table, which is a collaboration between the universities of Oxford, Wageningen, and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And it's an initiative that's been running for a year or so now, which tries to facilitate dialogue on the evidence, assumptions, and importantly, the values that underpin debates about the future of the food system. Fanny will be posting some more details about Table in the chat. The purpose of this event, and in a minute I'm going to welcome our panelists, one of whom is having problems connecting. So if she's not able to join, then we will do our best with two other really great speakers. But the purpose of today is to explore the question. Oh, good, April, you've joined. That's great news. Is to explore the question of limits in relation to food and the question of decoupling. So and in the context of net zero. So we hear a lot about planetary boundaries and limits, and we can question exactly where those limits lie and how hard they are when they come to crossing them. But the basic premise that is the starting point for today is that we have a finite world, but potentially infinite desires. And we also have legal targets for getting our emissions down. So can all these somewhat competing variables be somehow brought together and harmonized? So we have, as the kind of twin problems, we have the question of food. We have everyone knows that food is essential, but arguably we're eating the wrong kinds in the wrong quantities, and food is distributed unevenly. So we have 2 billion people worldwide who are overweight or obese, and then about 800 million who don't get enough to eat. And then you have the chronic cross-cutting issues of malnutrition in all its forms. But then we have the advertising sector, which has historically been fantastic at getting us to want more stuff, and really, really very successful at doing this. And so the question is, can it be, and as a result, it is responsible for much of the environmental damage and indeed the health damage that we see today. So the question is, can the advertising sector be repurposed to get us to want differently, better, and potentially even less? So these are some of the things that I'd like us to explore today, and specifically in the context of food, which is a special case in the way that an infinite number of shoes or iPhones or whatever it is not. And I think I'm very, very pleased to have three excellent panelists with me today. So Ben Essen, who represents the advertising industry single-handedly, and is also author of a report which offers quite a critique of the industry itself. April, who is Vice President of the Knorr brand at Unilever, and Professor Fergus Lyon, who is doubling up both as a professor focusing on social enterprise, but also who runs his own social enterprise, B Corp certified social enterprise. I'm not going to say anything more about them right now because I'd like them to introduce themselves. And this is going to be a discussion that's going to last for about an hour, after which there'll be a Q&A session. So just keep thinking about all the questions you might have during the course of the discussion, and we'll try and get to as many of those questions during the in that final half hour as we can. So just starting off with Ben. So hello, Ben. Perhaps you could just introduce yourself and tell us about this report, which was the inspiration really for organising this event.
Yes, of course. So hi, I'm Ben Essen. I'm strategy lead at a creative advertising agency called Iris, and we work with organisations like Starbucks and Yum Foods. I, as part of an industry sort of disruptor body called the Purpose Disruptors, co-authored this report, Advertised Emissions, last year. And what we were trying to understand is advertising is very good at measuring the uplift in the sales it generates, because that's how it proves its worth to clients. So could we take that data and calculate the uplift in emissions generated by the sales driven by advertising, and which we call advertised emissions? There's a parallel in finance, which is financed emissions. When you finance a coal power station, then your financed emissions are include that coal power station. And so we worked out essentially the emissions that wouldn't have happened if advertising hadn't driven that demand, which totaled for the UK in 2019 186 million tons of CO2 equivalent, which is equivalent to about half the UK's official total. And I guess it's so big because obviously so many things consumed in the UK aren't actually created in the UK. And we also worked out that works out as advertising is driving an uplift of 28% extra on top of the carbon footprint of every single person in the UK. So yeah, that's me. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. April, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you and Unilever in general is trying to address these difficult questions of growth and limits?
Yeah, thank you, Tara, and hi, panelists. Hi, everybody. Delighted to be here today. So I work for Unilever. Unilever's mission, if you don't know, is to make sustainable living commonplace. And obviously, it's a recognition that we're all part of the problem in terms of the climate crisis. And in order to solve that problem, we all need to be part of the solution. So we believe that business can be a force for good. And within Unilever, I look after the Knorr or Knorr brand, as it would be known in the UK, which is Unilever's second largest brand. And our mission is to reinvent food for humanity. So about a third of all greenhouse gases come from food, and we're proactively working to create a more sustainable food system, farm to fork, with a view to fixing the broken food system and indeed having a positive impact on planet and people.
Thank you, April. And Fergus, over to you.
Can you hear me now? My mic keeps going off.
Can hear you. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Fergus Lyne. I'm a professor at Middlesex University and Deputy Director of the Centre for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity, a research centre called CUSP, working with Tim Jackson and others at University of Surrey. Our focus on our research programme is all about how do we live well within our limits, and I lead a stream of work looking at alternative organisation and alternative business forms, with particular interest in social enterprise. Complementing my academic work, I also run my own business, which was the first B Corp farm in the UK, and we are a farm focused on regenerative agriculture, but working on a very small scale, but with a large conservation and education and a small education program alongside our food production.
Great, thank you. So I thought we'd just kick off with a question, perhaps starting with Ben. So, I mean, I think as your report demonstrates that the advertising sector is good at getting us to want more and to buy more. So the question is, do you think it's possible to get us to want differently or even less? And how do you address the question of greenwash, either real or perceived? Because I feel that there is a sense that the sector is, to an extent, damned if they do and damned if they don't, in that, we say that companies need to compete. And this is a question for advertising and indeed corporations who fund this advertising, that when they promote their ethical credentials, it can end up sounding like greenwash or the kind of co-optation and commoditization of really, really important movements, such as, for example, Black Lives Matter or Me Too or whatever it might be. So people do get angry that these global issues are being used to, sell soap or whatever it is. But at the same time, if they avoid these issues, then they're also criticised. So I just wondered, I mean, I think this is really a question both for Ben and for April, how you think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think in our world, and I'm a strategist, I talk a lot about outputs versus outcomes with our clients. And, the outputs are what are we saying? And to a certain extent, what are we asking people to do? The outcomes are ultimately what's the change that the client is measuring us against. And that's much more about some form of business, commercial objective and that we're trying to achieve for them. So when I think about the greenwash point, I'm thinking, greenwash happens when the commercial objective isn't about sustainable change. It's, we want to sell more of X. But that is achieved through some form of communication strategy, which says, well, actually, we'll do that by helping everyone see that we're the sustainable choice. And you've already seen a lot. So, that's where most of the contested advertising in the greenwash space has come from. It's like you're saying this, but actually the outcome that you're achieving through this advertising is contrary to it. So I, the focus for me, and the reason for advertised emissions is to focus on the objectives bit. If the brief is we need to limit the emissions that we generate in some way, and if that's kind of baked into what we're trying to achieve, then there's an authentic opportunity to drive that outcome. If it's not there, then it's greenwash. And I do believe that with the right objectives, if organizations are saying we want our advertising to achieve this outcome, reduction in waste, for example, then advertising has amazing power to drive the behavior and the ideas and that's going to achieve that. But it all starts with what's that brief, and ultimately what are you measuring, and what are you reporting to your corporation?
Thank you, April. I mean, Unilever has really kind of taken a very public lead in promoting its green credentials. So how would you address that accusation? And I could come up with some critiques, some argued critiques myself. So, for example, around let's say your Knorr brand, where I think one of the, and I'm not talking about the supply chain issues, I'm talking here about the consumption related activities, where you could argue that Knorr provides a way of adding flavour to sustainable foods, like plant-based foods. I think that is one of the ways in which you are arguing that Knorr can help do its bit for sustainability. And the same with your Hellmann's mayonnaise, which helps people to use up the leftovers in their fridge, turn it into a sandwich, and there you go. But arguably, people are going to be eating mayonnaise and using stock cubes, and they always did before this was seen as a sustainable thing, and they always will. So how has anything actually changed?
Yeah, so I think it's a great point, and I'm so passionate about fixing the broken food system that I really focus on the whole equation from farm to fork. So I think it's worth saying on the farm side, and even like for well over a decade, Tara, well before greenwashing or the whole green movement became cool, we were driving our farms and our ingredients to be sustainably produced with obviously for care for the land, livelihood for the farmer. So well before any of this became the vogue thing to do, we were really deeply invested under the umbrella of making sustainable living commonplace in sustainable sourcing, and it was a huge investment, and so we did that for a long time. We've now ramped up to the next level, taking all those farms from sustainable farms to regenerative agriculture farms, and now we're really focusing on the consumption side, because a big part of the carbon emissions comes from what people consume. So not just how it's grown, how it's made, but what people consume. So we are promoting, and advertising can be a great force for good in this regard, and getting people to, have one meat-free Monday a week, to take on a more flexitarian diet. And of course, we know in food that no one's going to consume anything that doesn't taste good, right? So we can talk about health till the cows come home, excuse the pun. But if the food doesn't taste good, people aren't going to eat it. So Knorr's proposition is really to make it easy and tasty to eat in a more sustainable way, and using the power of advertising to help drive that shift. Now we measure that shift and we have that shift audited. So our 2025 ambition is to get food what we call food that's good for people and planet, or our future 50 foods, or 50 foods which are inherently good for people and planet, on 7 billion plates by 2025. That's externally audited. We're driving that. And of course, we're using digital and traditional TV advertising to help drive that shift. So I believe that can be a force for good, because ultimately people have to eat. But if we can help people eat in a healthier way for themselves and a more sustainable way for the planet, we think that's a good thing.
That's very, very interesting. And will the methodology underpinning that auditing process be made publicly available?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's a basis of preparation that's externally audited, and obviously we'll be reporting on this in our annual report.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And so Fergus, I think the focus on sustainable enterprises is absolutely fascinating. People talk a lot about circular economy and alternative economic models. And as I sort of go about my daily life, I notice some of these, they come across my plate and in my purview. And just to give us an example, there is quite a well-known B Corp certified, and perhaps you could say a bit about what B Corp is for our audience. A social enterprise that sells bottled water, and it donates quite a chunk of its profits to water charities. But at the end of the day, it's selling us bottled water, and arguably this is what we don't need and part of the problem. So I just wondered how you thought about how you get a foot in the door of trying to change anything as a social enterprise without end up somehow reproducing the problems that you're trying to change.
Thank you. So I used a couple of terms there, so I can quickly explain some of them. But the term social enterprise is a very broad term that's generally looking at those organizations that are trading with a social or environmental purpose. There are different types of social enterprise. Some are much more like the charitable or voluntary community type businesses. Others are more at the more commercial end of a spectrum. And that's where, at that commercial end of the spectrum, is where we find the B Corp model. These are all for-profit businesses. So they don't have a sort of charitable legal form. They'll have a private sector legal form. But the key thing that they do is make a commitment in their articles, what they can be called the declaration of interdependence. And a commitment to take into consideration all stakeholders, not just shareholders. So it's going beyond that, maximizing shareholder value, to actually look at the wider purpose for the environment and society. And to do that, you've got to be registered as a B Corp. You have to go through an accreditation process, very rigorous way, demonstrating that you're measuring your impact, you're making the changes, and you're making change on a very wide range of different areas. And I think that comes back to your question about, going back to your example of the water bottles, because I think with many of these B Corps and other social enterprises, they're aiming to tackle a particular social or environmental objective, and then it's not being prescriptive about exactly what it will be. But recognizing as well that, like a water company that's giving its profits to WaterAid has got a core focus on that, addressing poverty in the South or in developing countries. And I think that's their core objective. How they balance that with their environmental objectives is the challenging issue. And I think in any social enterprise, they're always trying to balance the commercial objectives with their environmental and social. And it's interesting, the example you give is an interesting example where there might be a tension between the environmental and social objectives. Each organization has to find a way of trying to balance. So I wouldn't say there was one way is right or wrong, But I think it's there are many environmentally focused investments that don't have the social impact that others might have.
Absolutely.
And I think the challenge there for us is, how do we see a business having multiple objectives beyond profit for shareholders? And I think that's the crucial, interesting debate that comes out of social enterprise.
Yeah.
Just
Sorry.
Just on this, because I think there's something really interesting around advertising sort of advantage and its challenge in this space, which is it's always been quite a sort of reflective matchmaker of business agenda and consumer need. And I think the argument will always be to that case, well, if people want to buy water in a plastic bottle, then let's help them do that in a way that's as good as possible. And obviously, you can look at that in two ways. And I think one of the challenges advertising is now facing is, how do we have a little bit more editorial, control of what we do think is right and wrong to promote. But actually, there is this thing around meeting people halfway and meeting the people in the middle. And if what are people ready to do? And I think about Sainsbury's did their Harbsies campaign around COP26 last year. So why don't you mix some chickpeas in with your chicken when you make your next stew? Which in one way it's like, well, you're why are you promoting the use of the meat when if you took it out entirely that would be twice as good? But actually, if you're meeting someone in the middle, then and twice as many people therefore adopt this, then that's still going to be advantageous. And I think there's this real thing of advertising in some ways as a facilitator from where we are now to where we might get to be. And you push too hard and no one adopts it. You don't push hard enough and they all adopt it, but you don't get anywhere. And I think one of the big questions for us is, how do you find the right point on that scale?
Yeah. April, I mean, would you like to kind of comment on that from your perspective as a very
I couldn't agree more. So, I mean, I think one of our big challenges on Knorr, which we haven't cracked yet, and believe me, if anybody has ideas on this call on how we can, is making sustainable, healthier eating desirable, which advertising and creative agencies are really good at. But to be honest, we haven't really fully cracked it yet. So, and I think it is about meeting consumers where they are now. So if you go and you demonize meat and you make them feel guilty about what they're doing, they just switch off. They don't, people are bombarded with food messages about what they're doing wrong every day. But if you can make it a desirable, exciting, something aspirational, people want to do it. And if you can convert, the global reach of a brand like Knorr, one of the largest food brands in the world, if we can convert even, a small percentage of those people into a more healthy and sustainable way of eating, the scale of that impact across many, many countries is just massive. So we'd love, our creative agencies to help us create the desire for that, because people are eating, but unfortunately, we like to say they're eating too much of the same stuff. 60% of the world's plant-based calories come from just 3 ingredients: wheat, maize, and rice. So there's no diversity in diet. They eat too much of the wrong stuff. So they're consuming, in many geographies, not all, but in many, too much meat. So, they're consuming foods that drain resources from the planet. So we'd like to, obviously get them to consume less meat. And over time, maybe even we could envisage a world where people are much more, toward a fully plant-based diet. And we obviously want to drive regenerative agriculture practices. None of this stuff is easy. And without, advertising agencies helping us figuring out a way to tell this, because it's a complex story, right? I mean, how many consumers want to hear the story I just told? None. But if you can show them an exciting dish that they can have tonight with their family, that they're going to enjoy, and they're going to have some magic moments around, they're all for it. So, I think advertising has a huge role to play in being a force for good and counteracting some of the negative, unhelpful advertising practices out there. And I know, Tara, when we spoke, I told you I love Patagonia's campaign, "Don't buy this jacket," really getting people to hang on to their clothing for longer and even getting it repaired. That kind of advertising is hugely exciting for me, because it's driving awareness around the issues in a way that busts kind of category norms, and has, I think, impacted the way the fashion industry is going to market. So I think it can only be good.
But just to kind of, I guess, to be very gloomy about it, are people ready for this? I mean, I think, you yourselves at Unilever were the focus of criticisms by one of your sort of major investors, that you are spending too much time trying to do good and not enough time on the bottom line, which is why your shares have fallen and all the rest of it. And is this reflective of the fact that people don't care, or at least they don't yet care? And again, that comes back to, why are they not being persuaded to care?
Yeah, well, I don't actually think that's factually true, that our purpose and our share price are kind of connected. Our focus on purpose and the outcome of share price are connected. In fact, I think the share price is a function of different things, because in fact, the brands in Unilever which are driving purpose, Knorr, Hellmann's, Dove, are seeing really, really strong growth. So that would give you a basis of fact to say that actually consumers do want ethical brands. They do want brands that are trying to do the right thing. They are buying into that because those brands are actually growing. So I don't know that the narrative from the investor community is factually correct. And I have to just say, I'm a Unilever employee. I don't talk for the Unilever business. I'm giving you my opinion, but in my opinion, I think that's a flawed narrative.
I mean, the one thing I would just add on that is every brief that we start at our advertising agency, we start with the assumption that the audience doesn't care. Not just about sustainability, but about pretty much any, particularly about your brand, whatever it is. And that's our job is to make them care, and to find the thing that they do care about, and a way to kind of frame it and connect it to that. I mean, a great example, I was just judging some awards, and one case study that I think will be celebrated in the industry this year is a partnership between Dole and Anam, which to create a thing called Pinatex, which is a fake leather, an organic leather created from pineapple waste. And they've actually then partnered up with all the major fashion houses and launched this in clothing, etc. And it's a really interesting example of kind of creative innovation applied to the problem. It's not no one sort of said this is what the consumer needs and who's going to ask for it. It was about creative applied to a problem to create something else, and that that then drives the engagement. And that will be celebrated within the advertising industry as a great thing that we have created. So I think there is this broader definition around what advertising can do, and it isn't as simple as saying to someone, here's this thing that you were looking for. And actually, probably the most interesting sustainable solutions will be things that no one knew that they wanted.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where Fergus, I have a question for you that comes in that perhaps sort of jumps off from Ben's comment, that when it comes to social enterprises, one could see a situation where you have a sort of bifurcated approach to consumption, where on Sunday mornings you go off to the farmer's market for your niche bread and cheese, and then you go off to the supermarket for your laundry powder and loo paper and everything else, and what you're actually doing, and by the way, you're also going to buy a bit more extra cheese while you're there, and what you actually get potentially is an overall increase in consumption rather than a substitution of one product with an arguably better product. So it's kind of an impossible dilemma, given that nobody can wave a magic wand and change the system. But from a social enterprise point of view, how does one address that question? And linked to that, have you seen any examples of a social enterprise that produces less, or that sells us less, or the nothing at all, as with the sort of the Patagonia example that April was talking about?
I think one of the key things of social enterprise is that they can innovate in different ways. And you might take something like Divine Chocolate, having a different model of chocolate that actually really helps the farmers in Ghana, who are sort of the shareholders as well in the business. And I think some of these innovations and some of the innovations around fair trade are examples where you can have these wider benefits. How that actually, how that gets scaled up and gets mainstreamed, that's the real interesting challenge. And how do you do that on a larger scale? In terms of the other point about about social enterprises ending up, or any businesses ending up increasing consumption rather than substituting, I think that's a crucial question. And I think we've got a way of changing consumption that we need, and a different sort of idea of consumption. And traditionally, I know it's a real hard question for advertising, because traditionally advertising is there pushing novelty, fitting in with our sort of inbuilt psychological desire for novelty that is always there. And selling stuff is obviously going to be a quicker way or an easier way of doing that. Changing, meeting desires that are more about changing consuming habits is always going to be much harder. And that's, you probably need the best advertising agencies to do that. And I think some of the examples we hear of advertising doing that are great, but it is still such a small minority of the huge advertising industry that's going on. But whether the examples of change, of consuming differently, I think it is about examples of, for example, various healthier eating restaurants. There are various social enterprises and other restaurants that are pioneering better, different foods. There are examples of some ideas of recycling food and using food waste as well more creatively. So there, things like Rubies in the Rubble as an example of a condiment maker who's trying to reduce the waste of food by using that to go back into food production. And then consumers wanting to buy that product. You're not just buying the good quality product but at the same time you are buying into a changing consumption pattern. So it's kind of having more of an activist role in that way as well, which is an interesting way of changing consumption through different goods.
Yeah, but I suppose it links to... Carry on.
I was just going to build on. Yeah, I was just going to build on that, the waste point, because with our Hellmann's brand, obviously, one of the, probably the most loved mayonnaise in the world, is really focusing on this idea of waste. So 1/3 of all food is wasted. Imagine the carbon impact of that. Never mind the fact that, in the future, we may struggle to have enough food to feed. Imagine if you can really eradicate that waste issue. And one of the things that Hellmann's has done really cleverly, which I'm quite jealous of because I haven't cracked it on the Knorr brand, is they've created an occasion. So they ran a pilot in Canada that basically showed that if you can create an occasion, they call it fridge night. So one night a week where you encourage consumers through exciting recipes to raid their fridge and really cook with leftovers, they can have a significant reduction of household waste as a result of that. And that's a clever thing. So, and that's something that, advertising can do really well, is driving a change in behavior by creating a specific occasion, a specific moment that is kind of driving a societal or an environmental benefit. I think that can be a good thing. So I'm really quite excited about the impact we're having through that program.
And that is going to be measured, as you say, through the auditing process, the impacts of that sort of fridge night.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But so just, for me, like, the creativity of coming up. Well, first of all, the consumer planning inside of going in and finding out what is the hook that's going to get a consumer to change the behavior. and finding that nugget of an insight. So people like Ben, this is probably your day job, but you go in and you find that nugget of the insight to say, actually, we need to really create an easy way, create an occasion, an easy way for them to do that. And then bringing Fridge Night to life through not only advertising, but in-store activation, digital recipes, things like that. That's driving real consumer behavior change. But that it requires creativity and advertising spend. And I believe, and maybe this is naive, maybe this is my kind of utopia view of the world, but I believe the more brands that do stuff like what Fergus just described or what Hellmann's is doing, it actually convenes change across the industry. So other brands see you doing that and they're like, oh, we want some of that, so we're going to have our own Fridge Night, or we're going to try to jump on the plant-based trend and start launching more plant-based products and creating a plant-based revolution. And then an industry has an impact on a social or an environmental change. So I think when brands take leadership of these things and it's done in creative, entertaining ways, I think a lot of people want to follow suit. And I think that can be, again, advertising as a force for good.
And just to build on that, I think one of the things that's generally proven to be that the ultimate commercial outcome of advertising is that it drives people's willingness to pay more for something. So actually more than driving sales, which is attributed to lots of different things like distribution, advertising is good at getting people to certainly disproportionately value something and therefore be happier to pay extra money for it. Which is interesting because I often think in a carbon space, well, if you could get everyone paying twice as much for the same ton of carbon, then you'd halve your emissions while keeping your income flat, for example. And I think in the space of food, there's something around when you're getting someone to value something, really you're getting them to appreciate it. So the example of Hellmann's there, it's like Hellmann's has gone from this thing that probably you wasted more Hellmann's than anything because you stick it on the side of your plate and then don't have as much as you expected to, and it's it's the first thing in the bin. But actually, the more you associate it with creating nice flavors around nice experiences, then the more actually you're going to respect it, use it wisely, and ultimately pay more for it. And I think there is a big job around kind of food plus, creating added value around food through service, through experience, through narrative and stories that can actually help people to value the food, not in a way that makes them want to consume twice as much of it, but a bit like what's happened in the alcohol industry. That's gone from let's drink as much as we can to let's make a really nice cocktail and spend half an hour making it, pay overpriced costs for the alcohol in the first place, and build an experience around it. Is there the same opportunity to do that with food?
So this is where immediately a few questions come in, and so first is the question of affordability and who gets to afford to kind of pay for luxury effectively, or pay for the story. And I guess the second question is, within advertising, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And we have Unilever here, but who has made sustainability its mission. But how much do you see that within the food industry as a whole? This do you ever see? Are you beginning to see any competition for doing or being better, and the communication of that through advertising? Or do you still see it as a very small part of what it is you do?
Was that to me? Sorry.
Yeah, that was to you. Yeah.
I think I see it as a massive part of what we do. It's changed very quickly because it's a trend. So it is top of the list for our major food clients. And obviously there's a kind of race between how much if they haven't been doing what Unilever have been doing for the last 15-20 years, then how much is the can the story and the substance stay aligned versus one getting ahead of the other. So I kind of feel optimistic that there is that drive there, though I feel nervous that will quickly become overtaken by the cost of living crisis and there'll be more important things on people's plates. So I think the challenge around affordability is a really tough one through that lens, because in any context where the sustainable option it costs more to produce, but I do think that the rule applies that being inventive with the business model is a key opportunity here. So adding in the element of service, adding in elements of digital into what you're doing, in the way that, say, Hellman's has again. It's not just about I'm going to buy this product now. It's about the value add I can get through an app that helps me think about what I do with my food waste. I think all these elements are going to be crucial parts for anyone who's trying to drive that, and that's not just about making everything a luxury. That's about making money in more imaginative ways.
Yeah, if I could just build on that, Tara. I mean, just one little build on that. So obviously, for a mainstream brand like Knorr, affordability is a huge issue for us, and it does come down to tapping into really clever ways to keep food affordable while still staying aligned to your mission. So one of the products we launched in Latin America last year is a product called Rinde Más. Rinde Más in Spanish means yield more. And basically, it enables you. It's a plant-based kind of seasoning solution that enables you to, say, make a burger or a meatball with a third less meat, and basically get the same or greater yield. So it's a seasoning-based protein solution which helps you save money. So that's the proposition. You're saving money. You're cutting down your meat consumption, and you're also there's a kind of a benefit around taste and juiciness of that meatball or that burger. So it's coming at it in really clever ways, and so we are going to market with solutions that are directly tackling affordability.
And so, I mean, I think you've both made the case that there is some appetite within the mainstream sector for doing something different and promoting it differently and so forth. So the question to Fergus is, do you see a sort of a parallel rise in the kind of the growth in social enterprises focusing on food, and whether you could just give us a kind of flavor, excuse the pun, of the sorts of enterprises that are out there, from the kind of quite mainstream to the more sort of radical or challenging? I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very wide range. They are a small part of the whole food economy, the whole food system, and I think we've got to accept that there is really powerful pressures on increasing consumption, and the amount of advertising that is going into the worst type of food and the worst type of drinks aimed at children is still a huge issue. And I think everything we're talking about is all what could be done and what should be done, but I think we still need to tackle what is the norm almost at the moment. And I think that's, I don't want to give the impression that it's an easy one. And I think the social enterprises try and provide a much more radical alternative. I think in terms of sort of examples, they are ones which are trying to pick up on a particular niche. The ones I mentioned about waste, there's other ones looking at like toast ale, where they're taking bread that needed recycling and turning that into beer. Again, it's got interesting tensions there about whether the social and social impacts of beer drinking, whether that's positive, but also could have a negative. So you've got to balance out all of these things. But they're actually taking around, really embedding a circular economy model in practice. I mentioned as well the other ones doing the around the circular economy, like Rubies in the Rubble. There are others where it is about thinking about local produce as well, and how can we actually create alternative food systems that do link to local markets while keeping them still affordable, because a lot of farmers markets are quite elitist and can price people out. But then you can have a lot of other local food supplies, particularly where we're seeing interesting examples of what we call the ideas of like people supermarkets, where social enterprises, on the back of the food bank sort of crisis, where people are forced to go to food bank, they're actually setting up shops, getting in fresh produce, and then working with groups in how to use that fresh produce. So I think those social enterprises are really interesting. And then the other area that I'm seeing real interesting ideas is, and maybe this links into April's sort of ideas of how to get people cooking food in more interesting ways. And I think there are a lot of social enterprises working in communities where there may be less, where there may be less knowledge about cooking from fresh ingredients, and actually working on that. So work we're doing at the moment is with a nursery chain, where actually they realized that people are fed up of being preached at about healthy food. And actually one of the best ways to do it is actually to work with children's nurseries, make the chefs in the nurseries key players, rather than having a bad reputation that sort of had come in the past with dinner ladies and those sort of derogatory sort of approaches. Actually, if you had the nursery chef as a key player, then they can send homework back with the children, which is like packets of food and spices and other things, and then getting people cooking at home and actually changing behavior through these much more approaches that are more embedded in communities. And it's about finding different ways of changing behavior that reach in ways where messages about healthy eating and sustainable eating haven't really reached in the past.
So
Sorry,
go ahead, Ben.
I'd say, for me, it really links to actually one of the key objectives of the advertised emissions report, which is we have a kind of red, amber, green classification, and the transition is, of course, we need to be advertising less red every year and more green every year. And actually, the one of the major players in the advertising ecosystem we haven't really spoken about are media owners. So the Googles and ITVs of this world. And when I look at, for example, Sky introduced their net zero fund last year, where they were incentivizing smaller sustainable practices to promote themselves and scale up. We argue whether they should be scaling up if they're a community practice. But for example, Olio, the food sharing app, kind of won within that and was promoted on Sky, got free broadcast because of it. And for me, that's an interesting model where if do you transition by beginning to essentially tax the high carbon advertising and use that to incentivize smaller, what may start as community businesses, but actually, if they are sustainable, then presumably they can scale up without that scaling up being a problem. And for me, that should be a really natural part of the advertising ecosystem's growth and change. And actually, hopefully, as a creative agency, as these businesses grow, they also need some help from the agencies who create stuff for them.
Well, you've partly answered the question I was about to ask, which is the fact that these are fantastic examples that Fergus has been talking about, but they don't get the airtime, they don't get the viewer attention. And you've mentioned a tax, but I mean, at the moment, there is, other than bits and pieces of pro bono work or public information broadcasting type advertising thing, the money's just not in it, is it, from an advertising person's point of view?
I would argue, quite a lot of them have grown up. I mean, quite a few of them have been bought by Unilever in the last decade or so, and then they've grown and scaled. And so I think there is a point at which the money is there. The other thing I would say is, advertising has been in decline as an industry for many years already. It's become commoditized more and more. There's one film that's created globally and put out to hundreds of markets around the world. So there's less value already in businesses churning out ads for multinational corporations. And actually, the pivot that the best businesses have been doing is to low volume, high value creativity. And actually, and consultancy. So, the advertising industry, was a byproduct of the industrial age. It was like create demand for these mass-produced items. But really, it's the professional creative industry And there's probably no more adaptable industry, because it's got very low fixed costs and it's full of creative people who are constantly trying to reinvent everything. So actually, the advertising industry, I feel confident will find ways to make money, but it'd probably be more about high value creative innovation than it is about churning out loads and loads and loads and loads of marketing communications for their clients.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot at the moment about industry, but obviously there's the framing context, the playing field, as people always talk about, and I mean, the government hasn't been mentioned at all yet. So my question is to all of you, what kind of government action would actually help you do your job better? And I think that's a twofold question. One is what intervention would help people who want to do good things do better, and the other is to stop people who are being like totally counterproductive, parts of the food and the advertising sectors who are not being helpful. What would stop them? I mean, April, I'm sure you've talked a lot about this.
Yeah,
over to you first.
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, I think one of the things that is coming and will help is the carbon tax, because it's going to help the consumer understand at the shelf the real price of the food that they're buying, and of course that creates a level playing field for the food industry and will drive real change. I mean, there's nothing to get the food industry to change faster than a governmental tax, which drives the right kinds of behaviors. So look, I welcome those kinds of things. It creates a leveler playing field, and it drives change toward the right kind of behaviors within the industry, and also with the consumer. So so you see that coming, and it's interesting because sometimes it's hard to get people's attention, and then you show them what happens to your gross margin line, or what happens to your bottom line profit line, when things like this are introduced, and then all of a sudden everyone's saying, oh my gosh, we have to do something. So for me, it creates a really huge impetus for change. So I think government has a huge role to play in driving toward more sustainable, healthier food choices, and I welcome those changes.
And I mean, we've seen, there's either voluntary or mandatory nutrition labeling on so many products these days, and there are all these moves towards different kinds of environmental labeling. I mean, complex though they are. Would you welcome a move towards some kind of either compulsory environmental label or compulsory standardized reporting of companies' environmental impact across a range of different indicators? Would that sort of thing, would you welcome that?
Yeah, I think standardized approaches to nutritional labeling and or carbon impact labeling are a good thing. I do think it needs to be done in consultation with industry, but I really do think standardization helps. I think where it becomes difficult is where you've got multiple ways of coming at it, and then the consumer can't make sense of it, and then they lose trust. So if it's all about consumer trust, which at the end of the day, I think it is about serving consumers, it is about serving the multi-stakeholder model, whether it's farmers. I think creating transparency and trust is paramount. So for me, standardization and transparency are super important, and and will build the right foundation for change.
Yeah. I think linked to that is the whole issue of regulation. I think of businesses that are wanting to make the change and who are committed to a more sustainable future, are really wanting more regulation that raises the bar to their level where they want to be, rather than a race to the bottom. It's bringing everyone along to the same level, and I think that's a real need for regulation. And also it's how those regulations are put in place, and going back to the standardization. it can be done in a very costly way, or it can be done in better designed ways, which doesn't reduce the cost. But it does come back to the issue as with these higher standards, there may be higher costs, and it's about how do we ensure there's still affordability of food. So it does. There is a whole issue of food poverty at the moment. At the same time as us not really pricing in the environmental costs of the food at the same time. So it's a difficult one to tackle, but I think it needs, people, we have to address food poverty at the same time, which comes back to more structural issues around poverty in general.
And do you think that would you have any specific recommendations for what government should do that would specifically support and allow for the flourishing of alternative economic models of enterprise, that things that would incentivize that innovation and experimentation?
I mean, there's some very basic things. We could, even go back to the whole how we set up our businesses, just how we set up the Companies Act. We don't, at the moment, it's still there with this assumption of maximizing profit for shareholders, when actually a little tweak of the company law can be bringing in this idea that the purpose of a company is to serve society, to give us almost to have the license to operate approach. And I think just making the idea that businesses aren't there purely to maximize profit is one easy starting point. Then there's all other ways of encouraging innovations in these areas. There is ways of also regulating the bad behavior, and I think there's the whole issue of restricting advertising of negative food. I think is going to be is really crucial, and I think that needs to be addressed, particularly by those people paying for it. Those people buying it. In a way they have to. There's regulation there. And then I think maybe there has to be a greater tax on the sort of high carbon luxury tax, particularly where we can actually then start changing consumption into those things, because often the high carbon luxury doesn't make us happier, and it is the case of people buying, having people that can have more fun with less stuff. If we can actually find different ways of incentivizing different consumption, which again, there can be ways of encouraging more sustainable consumption.
Yeah, I mean, thereby hangs the tale. My wasteful luxury is somebody else's got to have essential, but that's the problem. Ben, I mean, what would help your industry do better and be incentivized to do better?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it does start with the advertisers and those buying advertising, and things like the carbon tax are critical. I think a lot of the leaders in my industry would probably stop there and say, well, it's the brands, and once that's all sorted, we'll just carry on making ads, right? I think that lets the advertising industry massively off the hook. And I think we need our own regulation that, for me, starts with just having much clearer accountability about the impact of the advertising that we create. So the moment the scope 3 emissions of a media channel or advertising agency will be about the flights they took to go to a meeting or to shoot an advert, with no mention of the outcomes generated by that advertising. So the whole idea that the advertised emissions are baked into the scope 3 of the big advertising holding companies, my agency, and indeed the likes of Sky, etc. Feels like a really critical step for those bodies to take seriously the idea that not all ads are created equal, and an Olio ad is not the same as an advert for a beef burger. So how do we incentivize that? And so it's a stepping stone on the way, which I think needs to happen as soon as possible, which is just forcing accountability around this, so that when people are putting net zero targets out there, they're realistically related to the full scope of things that business is responsible for.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think this is a useful point to turn to some questions, and we've been having questions in the audience, and do keep them coming through in the ask the question, not the chat, if possible. But I have a question that is probably addressed to you, April, but maybe you as well, Ben. Do you find that the majority of the public understand the terms the industry use, such as plant-based or flexitarian? Do we need to do more to make these words commonplace and help consumers tell the difference between plant-based, vegetarian and vegan? And indeed, I think that's a kind of broader question about people understanding some of the claims and terminology that's used.
Sure. Yeah, no, without question. And I think that the easy answer to that is I think there's, there are sophisticated consumers who really do understand the difference between vegan and vegetarian, but the mainstream really don't understand. And in fact, it's one of the things that, it's a head scratcher for me and my team on how do we best talk about this in a way that is, will create desire for these kinds of products and make it, not seem as if you're having to give something up to eat in a more healthy, sustainable way. So that is, and sometimes you see some of these, and it's funny because we're depicting right now in a visual mood board. And hopefully anyone in the advertising industry will know what I mean, but it's effectively like visual images that bring to life, where you are now and where you want to go. And currently, the plant-based kind of space is brown and green, pales, greens, and it's very kind of almost like beige and insipid. And we want to bring it to this much more vibrant, lively space. It's appetizing, that looks, like it's going to be really tasty and flavorful. But when you say vegan, vegetarian to most people, they think salad, they think kind of green and beige food. So there's a big job to be done, and I'm hoping the creative teams can help me with this, both the design teams, but the creative storytellers can help bring this new world to life in a way that people understand on a very intuitive level. In the same way, when you say Homer Simpson, everybody thinks about donuts, that link is just there. We somehow need to get people to associate healthy and sustainable food with this vibrant, tasty, lively world. And it needs to be so intuitive that people just understand it. We're a long way from that. So I really hope that my creative team and advertising agency are able to kind of close that loop.
And I mean, just to interject a bit, I mean, there's one additional thing, and this is for all of you really, is that plant-based foods are brown and green and also highly feminized. And there does seem to be a real gender issue going on here. And I was wondering if you look at, I don't know, my local supermarket, their in-house magazine, come Father's Day, it's all about the steak you're going to give dad. So how can that change? And what are the obstacles to it changing now? Why aren't the ads just being run that tries to change?
Well, this is a really good question, Tara, because I have to say, Game Changers, I don't know how many people saw that on Netflix, but it started to make, and there were a lot of bodybuilders and masculine men in there that were showing, what a plant-based diet could deliver in terms of performance. If you haven't seen it, Game Changers, have a look, because I saw a lot of people watching that and saying, actually, plant-based isn't, for feminine weaklings. I mean, that, like I said, those very intuitive associations would think vegan, vegetarian, weakling. Game Changers really started to create a link, but actually the healthiest, highest performing people are people that eat a more plant-based diet. So that's the beginning of a shift, right? When you start seeing it show up in popular culture, like it did with Game Changers, it starts to create those new mental associations and shift. We just need more of that.
Yeah, it's one of those fascinating ones, because I agree. I think that's the new trend in many ways. We did an ad for Pizza Hut recently, who've partnered up with Beyond Meat for a Beyond Meat burger, and it was all very masculine and all very like, yeah, people who like meat will love this burger type vibes. And the flip, it's a bit like KFC doing vegan. These things all help make it accessible to a different audience. It maybe has the flip effect, which is like, well, hold on, you're not really promoting any of the values. You're just promoting the product in the old way. You're just treating everyone like consumers. And so no one's really learning anything, actually, because you basically, you've done the back end stuff and then said, same old, carry on as you are. We've sorted it. And so I do think there's a real, that's the flip challenge here of like,
it's a tricky one.
How do you make it difficult for people? How do you make people need to engage at the same? How do you make, and I still think about things Oxford, I think we're involved in things like food miles and, 5 a day, these kinds of ideas that are about responsibility. They are about self-care. They are about stepping up and actually, kind of not just being a consumer, but being a participant in a net zero economy. And I do think we need to sometimes get people thinking a bit, doing the hard work. But obviously that's a harder thing to achieve.
Yeah. Well, I have another question about advertising tactics here, which is that Greenpeace has employed very sensational, controversial tactics to urge citizens and industry to, away from environmentally destructive practices. And I would add that PETA, the animal rights charity, has done something quite similar. It seems to be one of the most effective strategies in our attention economy to manipulate people through sexy and trendy advertising, to your point, Ben, in order to compete with big companies. Should green advertising employ this tactic more? I mean, this is basically, you've more or less answered that question, but I mean, I think the sort of the shock horror side of things, and I think this is a broader debate within the environmental movement. Do you turn people off with sensationalism, and do you get them to think that it's all too big, it's all too difficult, or does it ginger people up and get people to act? When do you scare people off, in short, with the sort of
I mean, for us, we've done so much testing on this, right? And I find, like, I don't know how you're feeling at the moment, but life is feeling pretty tough, with COVID and now the war in the Ukraine. And the last thing I want to do when I sit down to have my meal is feel bad about it, feel guilty about it. And we've done a lot of testing. We've tried, like, coming hard at the issue. We've tried different approaches. And, for most mainstream consumers, coming hard at an issue and an occasion they want to feel relaxed and they want to enjoy their food has not been a successful approach. I'm sure for a segment of consumers that might work, but not for the mainstream. And I think, when people feel entertained, when they feel excited, when they feel inspired, they're much more likely to have an open mind about doing a simple twist, for example, on a top dish. So, beans instead of beef in their spaghetti bolognese, or, a bean-based curry. If it looks exciting and interesting, something I can do that makes me feel a little bit better about the meal I'm having, either in terms of my health or the planet, much more openness. But if you hit them over the head with all the scary facts, it seems to push a lot of people away.
It's interesting. I mean, the kind of people like novelty, and the key lesson of how advertising works is do something different to whatever else is doing. And all the greatest advertising has always been surprising, timely, at the right moment in time, coming out with something that's completely counterintuitive and different. Right now, I think that is taking, it's kind of, we've just had Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg, and a real awakening around the shock and the anguish, of where we've got ourselves into, and therefore, as a counter to that, it's great that brands are showing up and kind of disarming that and going, it's okay. My view is that only works because of the shock that came for 2 years before it, and actually it will only work for a while, and then that will become wallpaper. And actually, I think so all these levers are going to need to work together at different times. Transparency and authenticity, I think, is that's another thing that advertising does. The idea that you can really help someone connect to the real story of a product that you bought off a shelf, helping you understand where that came from, its history, its origins, its rituals. That's something that advertising can do, which again will help people value it and see it as a kind of more core part of their own lifestyles. So I think there's.
To quote you, Ben, that your starting point is that people don't care, and then to misquote you, that your starting point is that people don't believe. That are people not very, very cynical when they see an advert that gives an origin story, or that purports to care or to bring people into a family of anonymous other people who are also consuming? I mean, I'm channeling cynicism here. So how does that, how could you comment on that, perhaps?
I think, to be slightly cynical about it, I think the answer is you do it well. I remember Domino's did the Domino's pizza turnaround in the US back in 2010. And they started by saying, turns out everyone hates our pizza and they think it's totally fake and it's not grown in this way. And, very disarming moment before saying, so we've totally changed everything and here's what we do. I totally believed that because of the way they told that story. And then they showed someone picking a tomato, some farmer, in a way that showing a farmer picking a tomato would have meant nothing somewhere else. Now, that was 12 years ago, and actually the standard was lower then. But I think there are ways to take an authentic, story, as long as you're telling the truth, take an authentic story and help people to care about it and help people to believe it. There was one app I saw actually that it was using blockchain to help organizations show content of product being made and align it to the product. So you could actually almost like scan the product and see this was the product. And you could actually kind of check that what you're seeing is, the coffee bean you're seeing being picked does actually align to the coffee that you're buying. I think there's some interesting ideas like that need to grow and come through that just change the game a little bit around transparency.
Well, if we're talking about sort of trust and a different narrative, I mean, there is obviously the story, and this is a question that has come through, which is, do we need to change what we mean by luxury and success? And I mean, this is a question for Fergus, because you've spent, you spend your working life, among other things, working with the Centre for the Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity, and these must be questions that preoccupy you all very, very deeply. So how do we, and outside the sort of the commercial sphere, how do we prompt different reflections on what a good life means and how we define success?
Yeah, and that's a crucial sort of question that we've been looking at throughout the last sort of 5-6 years in the centre. And what we're finding is that it is about having more fun with less stuff. Quite often, it's about finding those ways which are leading to happiness and well-being. And if we can find the sweet spot where there are those activities that consume less resource but have more well-being and happiness, and that a lot of those issues are around particular sectors. So maybe it's not spending so much on shifting spending patterns, putting more money into areas like participation in leisure and in arts, and spending more, how we spend our time as well. So I think there's different ways that we can consume, act as consumers. I think there's it is about, in the food sector, it raises questions about how do we create well-being? How do we do things that are linking food with caring, linking food with friends, and turning it into a more ways of well-being. And I think that was so evident during the pandemic with the isolation that was going on, and food being so important for bringing people together. So it's about thinking about those things differently. Again, it raises questions about what sort of economy we want going forward as well, because we still, we need, economies that will create jobs and create good jobs. And I think that raises other questions for the food sector: of what's a good job in the food sector. And it's, it may well be that we can think differently about food consumption, but about how we eat out, as well as eating in. How we can create new markets that both, that allow people, that they can create good jobs, but also create more sustainable consumption as well. So whether there's different forms of rather than eating fast food, eating slower food when eating out, finding ways of reducing the waste when eating out, and finding ways that there can be some alternative food economies going forward, which create the good jobs rather than and displacing the bad consumption that we've got at the moment.
But I mean, I think the sorts
Tara,
of...
we haven't talked about media. We haven't talked about media at all, Tara, because I mean, we talked a lot about advertising, but like, my daughter is 14 and she spends time, on social media, and, desire is created through the content she's constantly fed. And, obviously that content comes from the advertising industry, but these media platforms have a role to play too in responsible responsible content. So I think advertising has one role to play, but certainly media platforms have an important role to play as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, I think a lot of what I think at least you're saying, Fergus, is that an alternative world is a world that is, a lot of it is cheap or free, and there is a great deal more agency on the part of the individual citizen as citizen rather than consumer. So profit-wise, economy-wise, this suggests a radical difference. And right now, in the current sort of time period, a company like Unilever will sink if it decides to be too radical and say, sorry, folks, we're not going to sell you anything more. We suggest you make your own vegetable stock, or whatever it might be. So how do you balance that? I mean, we're going around with the same questions, but they seem to be so difficult. How do you try and do something different when everything conspires against you're being able to do that?
One interesting area, I mean, it's got a lot of flaws in it, is the movement to deliver what do you call it, the deliveries of food with menus, where you're kind of encouraging people to actually consume a bit differently rather than getting a takeaway. Why not order in advance a box with all the ingredients in it and a menu card and instructions to learn. And I think that's quite a radical change that that's really taken off more recently, that actually does encourage people to consume differently, and they're adding a lot of value to food and creating successful businesses from it, but also it is shifting people into the cooking for themselves. And again, it comes back to this idea of how we consume, and also how we what activities we get in, and the evidence showing that people get a lot of satisfaction from activities that are creative, that are allow them to get into the flow, or to take their mind off other things. And actually, if we can change the way of making cooking into something that's not a form of relaxation, then there is a big movement on that as well. And the role of social media on that, of my teenage daughter, and the number of food sort of looking at food YouTubes and things like that, and the inspiration she's got for cooking from that. There's avenues there that can be positive. Although you have to look at the packaging and the fuel costs of deliveries and stuff like that as a downside of some of these box schemes. But there's potential there, I think, to consume, showing that we can consume differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the discussion so far has been very, very global north centric, but one of the questions sort of that I've just had changes tack really, which is it's about lessons to be learned for expansion in other parts of the world. So how can this discussion be applied to parts of the world which isn't facing the same issues yet? are there lessons to be learned and problems to be avoided, or will all markets have to go through this cycle of driving overconsumption and then dealing with the fallout from that overconsumption? So do you have to go up and then down again, or is there a way through it? And I mean, I know you advertise, April, in the developing world, and Ben, you must have clients with markets all over the place. Are there good examples there of doing something differently?
Well, I think, first of all, I think not all cultures are overly materialistic. I think there are many cultures throughout the world that don't place as high a value as some cultures in the West do. They think that's the first thing, and that for me is hugely encouraging. That there are cultures that actually understand happiness is not derived through, accumulation of material goods, how many shoes you have, how many, cars you have, all of this stuff, that kind of reject that. So I think that's good. And I think one of the things that we do in developing and emerging markets is markets like Africa, we're really trying to take a view. So we have a program in Africa, South Africa, called Plate of the Nations. So we've done a lot of work to understand what's on the average South African plate today, and what a few simple shifts to that plate might do for betterment of health and betterment for the environment, whilst keeping affordability central. Because honestly, in many markets, unless people can afford it, it doesn't matter whether or not they want it or not, they can't buy it. So, but really starting from the point that the market's at. So if a market's at a place where, they're consuming, in the case of South Africa, a lot of white rice, or a lot of kind of starch, and we can help them make a simple shift toward a healthier starch, a healthier grain, and in doing so, support local South African farmers. We believe that's a shift worth making. And then, of course, we work on the upstream side, making sure that we create access to those supply chains for the consumers, and that we set up availability for those alternative choices. So I think it's about starting wherever the market is, and then trying to make incremental changes for good, and where you can. But with food, it's difficult. I mean, the 5 a day one always makes me smile, because we've been promoting 5 a day forever in a day, and yet people still ate the same amount of vegetables. They're not eating any more vegetables. So, so I think it's recognizing how difficult it is to make consumer behavior change, but making it interesting, making it exciting, and starting from the point that people are at today are key drivers of success.
Yeah, I mean, Ben, you have clients all over the world.
Yeah, I think sort of my concern, maybe less as an advertiser, more just as a human, is the sense, the extent to which we try and do it for people in emerging markets or the global south, rather than with them. I think you've talked a lot about the kind of power dynamic here, and actually, one thing I see is our clients can scale innovations very quickly and easily, and I talk about the Pizza Hut Beyond Meat. That's a classic thing where you've got an innovator in Beyond Meat, they've got a distributor in Pizza Hut that suddenly means that they can get into hundreds of markets around the world, and you'll see more people eating alternative proteins in those markets quite quickly, I think, as a result. Obviously, the flip of that is you're introducing a product with IP based in the US as the way for them to do it, rather than ideas on how they can go and do it themselves. And I think that's while we might be talking on behalf of other regions, we are still, I certainly am still representing primarily Western companies who are trying to capitalize on growth in these other markets, and I think there are some big moral questions that we need to be asking ourselves as that becomes more and more the focus of growth.
And I think that one other thing I might observe, just by my own personal opinion, is applying, what not applying different standards to your customer base in the global north as you do to customers where regulations, if not adequate, are definitely better, to your customers in the global south, where you see a lot of double standards applying. I think that's actively not doing bad is probably a way forward, at least a starting point. But yeah. But I mean, I think your example with the Beyond Meat raises also the question: to what extent are you providing people in arguably a paternalistic way with something good or better and more sustainable, and to what extent are you taking away or cannibalizing existing small scale enterprises, local food cultures, and so on and so forth? I mean, that is a difficult question that. I guess we don't have a lot of time to answer, but I mean, if you could comment on that, April, in like the 2 minutes before I'm going to ask you to round up, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I'm just reflecting a bit on the South Africa example. So I don't think, I mean, look, Beyond Meat burger is out of reach for most of the world. Let's be honest, it's an expensive product, right? So I don't necessarily think it's always about selling people a new innovation. It might be just opening their eyes to what's in their own backyard. So, you know, the Knorr Future 50 Foods report we don't sell any of those ingredients. There are 50, you know, ingredients that are very often grown in people's backyards that if they consume more of them, it can be better for them, better for their local community, and better for the land. So, you know, our role as a food advertiser for me is, you know, highlighting some of those ingredients. It's not an innovation, you know, it's not a Beyond Meat, but saying to the guys, hey, you know, consider, you know, consuming fonio versus rice. And do you know that by doing that, you can help South African farmers? It's actually more nutritious than white rice. And it has really strong benefits for the environment and raising awareness around, you know, ingredients that are accessible. Moringa, for example, very often in many of the markets that we service, people can actually go out and cut that from their backyards and saying, you know, consume more of these types of locally grown ingredients. Obviously, you know, we'll help you inspire you with recipes and make them taste good with Knorr. But, you know, I would love to see all of the food industry talking about those kinds of ingredients, because those can make a major shift, and they're hugely affordable. So I just the reflection I have on things like Beyond Meat is, yeah, all well and good. And I think it has a role to play. But I don't know how really, you know, unless, you know, the dynamics of that industry and those products changes quite significantly. I don't know how that's going to be affordable for mainstream consumers.
Yeah. So I'm going to end with one last question, because some contributor called RN has asked a very kind of well-judged question to end with. Interpret it as you will. Are you decoupling desire or selling sustainability? So Ben, discuss.
Well, I'm definitely getting paid to sell sustainability, I think, and that's that's the current paradigm. And I think my industry is in a space where we're still in service. We're hoping that the clients we're in service to have got some better ideas for us to sell, and that's not going to be enough, long term. I don't think that our industry can just rely on changes elsewhere and be the salespeople for it. I'm sure that's part of what we'll do, but I do think we need to go very deep into this question, ask ourselves some really uncomfortable questions around, what our industry is, and go through that. I kind of, any creative brief I've ever written starts with, what's the tension that we need to resolve? And so I like to think that as a creative person, what you're looking for is an irreconcilable tension that you can somehow conjure up some magic in solving. And when I think about decoupling desire, it's the ultimate irreconcilable tension of like, how do we ensure, the prosperity, what is a job and an industry for millions of people around the world, can still be that, but in a way that is allowing everyone to eat the amount that they need to be eating. That's not going to answer that in the next 10 minutes or 10 years, but I think half of the job should be about trying to tackle that, and I think that's the sort of exciting challenge, I think, for anyone who's working in my industry and trying to feel okay about it.
Well, thank you. Fergus.
I'm not quite sure I quite heard all of the question. I got cut off for a moment, but I think going back to the whole issue about decoupling desire, it is about changing the way that our whole capitalist system is really organized to actually have something that's got more wider purpose in the businesses, and actually getting business to actually be defining what the purpose is, whether it's from the food producer to the manufacturer, retailer, the financiers. But I think today it's really interesting discussion is around what's the purpose of advertising, and I think there is a positive role, you could say, in some ways of changing behavior, but too often I think the majority of our advertising is being driven by a need to sort of sell more stuff, and being particularly in the less sustainable areas. And I think that's where it's good to have this conversation to actually ask advertisers what's their purpose, and actually to get advertisers to, the companies themselves to actually justify who they're working for and why, and also to get, have advertising companies that do go for more than maximizing shareholder value, and to explain, are they really doing that, and not just doing sort of the greenwash that we sometimes see. And that's why I think the report's really good, because it actually really highlights that there's that Ben's report really highlights that there is a crucial issue going on here that's not really being it's being slightly swept under the carpet.
And April, last word to you before we end.
Yeah, no, just I think we're creating a desire for a more sustainable lifestyle and more sustainable choices versus decoupling desire. And my dream would be that we make unsustainable ways of cooking and eating as obsolete as the landline telephone. That would be my dream. And it can, obviously it can happen, but we need the help of very smart people like Ben and Fergus to help us find a path there.
Well, thank you very much to Fergus, Ben and April. It was a really, really great discussion. We haven't got the grand answer, but we were never going to get that, and I hope we can continue our discussions. So thank you very much to everyone who's attended. Fanny has been posting up other ways of engaging with Table in the chat, so join us again for a future talk. So with that, the event is over. So goodbye, have a good afternoon, enjoy the sunshine. Yeah, bye-bye.